Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Artsbeat TV and Radio here on Westville Community Programming Channel 15, 89.5 FM WSKB, and now Southwick Community Programming as well. I'm your host, Mark Auerbach, and today we have an opportunity to chat with Kevin Winkler, who has been on this program before because several years ago he wrote this wonderful book about the choreography and the musical theater of Bob Fosse. And he's gone back to the drawing boards and written a new book that's just come out, and it's all about Tommy Tune, the dancer turned director and choreographer. And I've got to say, Kevin, first of all, it's great to have you back. And second of all, Tommy Tune is my favorite musical theater choreographer and director of all times.
Really?
And the reason being that when I started my career in musical theater and ended up in Houston, Texas, working with the Houston Opera and Houston Ballet, everybody in the theater community in Houston could only talk about Tommy Tune. And I had seen Tommy Tune in shows in the chorus of a couple of musicals, including a pre-Broadway show that played at the Starton Theater here in West Springfield called A Joyful Noise. And he was in the back of the chorus. He was like 6'6", and the next tallest person was like 5'8". He stood out. And then the next season was back in the same theater in the chorus of a show called How Now, Dow Jones. And so Tommy Tune's, to me, was always just this tall, lanky singer-dancer. But when I got to Houston, he was considered a god. He was from Houston and would continue to come back and work with the young singers and dancers. And I believe now there's a theater award named for him in Houston for high school and college-age students. So, Kevin, welcome back to Artsbeat.
Mark, it's great to be here. Great to see you and great to speak with you again. Seems like only yesterday I was on here talking about Fosse.
That's true. So I know that the Tommy Tune book has just come out, and it's all over the map. I mean, no matter what theater website you go to, people are chatting about it. What made you decide to write about Tommy Tune?
Well, he's always, like you, he's always been one of my favorite director choreographers. And I'd come to feel over the last, I don't know, X number of years that he'd become a somewhat undervalued figure in musical theater. When people write the histories and the commentaries about musical theater, he tends to be left out or given short shrift. And I thought that was a shame because I think he's a very important figure, a real transitional figure between a couple of different generations of director choreographers. And I just don't think he has gotten his due as an artist and a real creative force in musical theater. So I thought if I wrote a book that did a deep dive into his creative life, that would fill a gap.
Yeah, I mean, for those people that go to Broadway regularly, you don't see him perform that often, although he did perform in his own musical, My One and Only. But his staging of musicals from the Will Rogers Follies to Grand Hotel to A Day in Hollywood, The Night in the Ukraine, his shows have a stamp on them. And unlike Bob Fosse, where you can say, that's a Bob Fosse show, Tommy Tune's shows, each one are very different.
Yes, indeed. And you're right, he doesn't have a particularly identifiable choreographic stamp like Fosse does. He really tailored his work to the demands of the material. And so his shows are wildly different. Best Little Whorehouse in Texas couldn't be any different than from Grand Hotel. And the Will Rogers Follies couldn't be any different from Nine, for instance. And yet, they all have the stamp of his sensibility, his theatrical imagination, and that kind of panache that he brought to musicals.
Did you ever work with him? Did you have the chance to dance with him?
No, I never did. He was working at a time when I was still dancing, but our paths never crossed. I wasn't a woman, so I couldn't be in Nine. I wasn't a black tap dancer, so I couldn't be in My One and Only. I didn't look like a football playing Aggie, so I couldn't be in Best Little Whorehouse in Texas. So I never had that opportunity, unfortunately.
I found some of the work that he did just so ingenious. When I was working in Houston, he decided to stage the national company of Best Little Whorehouse in Texas in Houston at a theater
Mhm.
that had been a movie theater and was turned back into a stage theater called the Tower because it was set in Houston. And I remember working in Jones Hall, which was the art center of the
Mhm.
time,
Mhm.
when the Nutcracker was shut down by this television consumer reporter, Marvin Zindler, who was white haired and loud and
Right.
obnoxious and all of that, who shut it down because people that left during the performance were not allowed to return until the intervals and
Mhm.
everything. And it was the same Marvin Zindler who was in the Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, the guy that the reporter that shuts down the chicken ranch, and the
Right.
chicken ranch was a real brothel in a real town outside of
Right.
Houston. So when Tommy Tune came to town to cast it, he cast it with a lot of equity actors that were Houstonians,
Right.
and they used the opera house to rehearse and things like that. It felt like a real homegrown thing, and I had a chance to watch him rehearse a couple of times,
Oh,
and
wonderful.
he was just one of the people with some great ideas and
Yeah.
like, why don't we all try this? He
Yeah.
was not a taskmaster or like a George Balanchine or a Michael Bennett or a Bob Fosse, but he was just like one of the guys in the chorus that said, let's do a show.
Yes. Yes. Uh, that's a good description of him. And that production of Best Little Whorehouse in Houston was the first open-ended show to ever be produced in the state of Texas. And I think it ran for over a year, and then I think it toured that
Yeah,
production.
I left Houston while it was still running, but it
Mhm.
was the first time that I mean, touring shows came to Houston then, and they would come for a week or two,
Yeah,
and then roll on to somewhere else. But it was there for well over a year.
yeah.
In the course of doing the book, did you get to sit down and talk with him a lot, or was he gracious in terms of his time?
Yes, indeed. I did get a chance to. I actually spent quite a bit of time with him. I spent I spent a number of long afternoons at his apartment in New York, and then after COVID hit, we spent we had a couple of long telephone conversations during that time as I was finishing it up. So yes, that was really one of the joys of working on the book. And he was very, um, he was, he opened his memories, he opened his home, his memories, his reminiscences to me. He didn't hold anything back. Nothing was off limits. I could ask him anything I wanted. And we really had wonderful conversations. And I was able to really, I don't know. I'm sure you had this experience. You probably, if you sat down with someone who was an idol of yours, you'd probably have all kinds of questions to ask him or her. And that's the way I felt with Tune. I had dozens and dozens of questions to ask him about each and every show, every project he did, and he was patience personified. Um, we sat for hours, and he would just as I said, answer any question. Nothing was off limits. So that really made it really special. Um, in the library world, we have a term called primary source material, meaning the ultimate item, the real thing. Um, and so for this book, Tommy Tune was my primary source material.
Plus, we're very lucky because in the world of YouTube and all of these things, when you look at some of the choreography by Michael Bennett or Bob Fosse, there's only selected amounts that you really find on YouTube. But it seems like Tommy Tune's stuff is all over the place. There was a special, I guess it was a PBS special, where they took some of the better Tony Award
Right.
production numbers from various musicals along the way And there's something about the song or a dance number, Kicking the Clouds Away, from My One and Only, that had
Oh yeah,
appeared on the Tonys, that you can find on YouTube with Tommy Tune and Twiggy, that is probably 7 minutes of dance ecstasy. Or
yeah,
the campaign song from the Will Rogers Follies that's out there.
yes indeed.
And it's all very accessible and it's fun. I mean, everything that he choreographs and does is fun.
And everything was different. Um, Will Rogers Folly, again, as I said before, Will Rogers Follies is different from the dancing, the clog dancing cowboy football players in Best Little Whorehouse in Texas. That's also easily available on YouTube as well. But again, he tailored his work to the specific needs of the material. He didn't bend the material to his style or interests. He really served the material, and that's why there's such a wide range of materials, a wide range of musical moments that you can find on the internet from his shows.
Is there a favorite dance number or a favorite show of Tommy Tune's that, after having done the book, you went back and saw, well, this is quintessential Tommy Tune?
Oh, there are. How long do you have? I could talk about favorite numbers all day, but I'll mention a couple of numbers that I have a renewed appreciation for. Um, in Best Little Whorehouse, there's a wonderful number called the Angelettes March, with a group of girl drill team dancers during halftime at a football game. And one of the dancers that I interviewed for the book, said that there was no dance number there in the script. It was just a little a kind of crossover section where there was going to be a commentator talking about the game and so forth, and announcing that the drill team was coming on and that sort of thing. There was nothing there, no sketch for a dance number or anything. And it was Tune who had the idea to take two life-size dolls, put them on either side of each real life female dancer, and take 8 dancers and turn them into 24 dancers. And there's this very witty, funny commentary that Larry L. King wrote that they interspersed with the dance numbers, and suddenly with the drill team routine, and suddenly you had a full-blown musical number that was witty. It had a satirical edge to it, and that all came from Tune's imagination. So I really had a renewed respect for that number and just his ingeniousness as a creator from that particular number. I will say my favorite show, really, of all of his is 9. Because it's so audacious. It doesn't look or sound like any other musical. Tune was very much responsible for the look and the whole texture of that show. It was his idea to cast an all-female ensemble surrounding Raul Julia in the lead role. And he brought in a book writer, Arthur Coppett, the playwright Arthur Coppett, to really delve into this character's mind and have the women in the ensemble spring from his mind and his memories in that show. So it's a really unique and a show unlike any others. And that, I think it's my favorite of his.
I think I sat through that. I was living in New York at the time, and I had learned how to slip into shows at the intermission with a playbill that you found in a dumpster nearby. Everybody seemed to know how to do that. But Tommy 9 was, he designed it all in black and white. The first, took place in a spa, and the first, I guess they were all in black at the beginning. And then he had this film director come up with this grand canal sequence, and all of a sudden the stage bursts into color. Yeah. And that was one of the most exciting pieces of theater ever. And I was talking with somebody else how he took in My One and Only. He and Twiggy splashed in a wade
That's right.
pool, splashed a tap dance number. The stuff that he came up with was clever or beyond clever.
Yeah, he told me the idea for the number. That's the so wonderful song and dance number in My One and Only, where he and Twiggy are supposed to be dancing in the Atlantic Ocean. And he said he used to have a house out on Fire Island, and he liked to go out and splash around in the water, and he would sort of tap dance in the sand, with the ankle up around his ankle, or the water up around his ankles. And he said that's how he got the idea to do that number with Twiggy. And it's so elegant. There's a beautiful minimalism to it. He can suggest the whole Atlantic Ocean with just a tiny narrow strip of water downstage. And that's, I think, one of the other hallmarks of his work. There's a kind of a conceptual minimalism to his work. When I wrote the book on Bob Fosse, I did argue that he was the ultimate minimalist. But now that I have taken a deep dive into Tommy Tune's work, I feel like Tune's right up there with him as a kind of a grand minimalist. Tune always says, I'd rather get my effects with fewer gestures. Why do I need to use 10 or 12 gestures if I can get the same effect, the same impact with just 3 or 4? And that way I can use the imagination of the audience to fill in those blanks.
And his shows were very minimal. When you think about it, the Will Rogers Follies took place on a huge staircase. And the floor would change colors every once in a while, but there weren't a lot of set pieces to that. And Grand Hotel takes place in one room where, by people moving chairs and poles around, could create a lobby bar or a lobby or a bedroom and all of that. And My One and Only also was just a very simple show in terms of sets and costumes. It was all choreography and real razzmatazz, the kind of thing that you go to a musical and you want to see.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that about My One and Only, because it had a very stark Russian constructivist design with large blocks of scenery that would move up and down in primary, all done in primary colors. There were no props in that show, very few set pieces. Everything moved on and off computerized, so the better to clear the stage for dancing, and that's one of the really that was one of the brilliant things about that show. I think that show has a real avant-garde feel to it in a way that maybe people don't identify with just an old-fashioned Gershwin show. It's far from an old-fashioned Gershwin show. It was really state-of-the-art stagecraft and direction for that period.
And I understand, according to theater lore, when the show initially tried out in Boston before it went to Broadway, it was in trouble. It was a heavy directed show. I don't remember who was the director of it. And Tommy Tune was just the star. And by the time they got through the run in Boston, he had taken over the staging of it and completely revamped it and turned it into one of Broadway's biggest hits of all times.
Yeah. Well, actually, yes, you're right about all that. The show was originally directed by Peter Sellers, Sellars, the director, not the actor, Peter Sellers. Peter Sellers was kind of a boy wonder of not-for-profit theater at that time. And he was hired to kind of do a revision of the Gershwin's Funny Face from the 1920s. To star Tommy Tune and Twiggy. And Tune was actually choreographing the show. He and his a frequent collaborator, Tommy J. Walsh, choreographed the show. And he, of course, was starring in it. And Sellers' work was very ponderous. I remember I interviewed the production stage manager for the show, who said the show ran, I don't know how long, 3.5 hours long. He said there was no connecting music to get from scene to scene. He said, at one point, he said to Peter Sellers, how are we going to get from scene to scene? We don't have any scene change music or anything. And he said, I'm quoting the stage manager, he said that thing that strikes terror into the heart of a stage manager. We'll figure it out in Boston. So they got to Boston, and the show was really a shambles, and they literally could not get through it. So Sellers was fired immediately before there was a single performance. And the producers came to Toon and they said, we're going to, if you don't come on board and direct the show, we're going to close it. And Toon said, whoa, 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 wait a minute. I'm choreographing, I'm starring, I'm teaching Twiggy how to tap dance. This is too many hats. But they said, well, if you don't do it, we're going to close the show. So he stepped up and, as you said, really made it a swift, fast-moving musical delight that became a big, big hit.
Yeah, I mean, he's just done so well in his career, not only choreographing and directing, but he continues to perform.
Oh, yeah.
I saw him at Encores a few years ago in a Gershwin. I don't remember which
Lady Be Good.
Lady Be Good, and he had two songs in it.
Yeah.
One was Fascinating Rhythm, and the other one was The Little Jazz Bird.
Little Jazz Bird.
But he stopped the show both times.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah. His chops are still great. You know, he's got his chops. You know, he continues to perform. He hasn't been performing during the pandemic, but right up to that point, he continued to tour and perform, and do his own. He has a concert act, a cabaret act that he's performed all over the country, all over the world.
Yeah, and I think that's, you can find that on YouTube. And he also performs with the Manhattan Rhythm Kings a lot. He's done An Evening at the Boston Pops, where you can often find his work. So now that you've written about Bob Fosse and Tommy Tune, do you have another book in the offing?
Oh, yeah. Well, I've got a couple of ideas that are kind of floating in the back of my head. They're trying to move their way to the front. What would you like to see? What's a book that you would like to read?
I'm not sure. I mean, the other major choreographer in my mind is Michael Bennett. And I mean, oddly enough, Tommy Tune's career and Michael Bennett, they were intertwined for quite a while before
Yes,
they
were.
went their separate ways. But I think that Bob Fosse and Michael Bennett and Tommy Tune are the ones that have left the biggest imprint on the musical theater that we all know today. There are young, up-and-coming choreographers. There was a production up here at Barrington Stage called A Crossing, which is apparently Broadway-bound. Joshua Burgas, who choreographed their revival of On the Town. He's a bright, shining star in choreography and musical, maybe the next generation of Tommy Tune. But I think from the generation that you and I are from, those are the big three.
I would say so. There's Goward Champion, also. People like Joe Layton, who doesn't get a lot of attention or credit. But yes, I'd say those were certainly the big three. In terms of just the sheer number of hits they had, one show after another was a success with those men you mentioned, and they can't help but have an impact. Certainly, I think certainly Fosse with Chicago, which of course the revival happened after his death, and Michael Bennett with Chorus Line. Those are kind of career-defining shows. Tune never really had that. He had many successes, of course, but he didn't have a kind of career-defining hit that just ran for forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. And I think that may be one of the reasons why he doesn't get as much love or as much attention as some of the other choreographers you mentioned.
Well, the other thing is, I don't think you can brand him with one particular style or look. I mean, the first time that I really became aware of his work was with Seesaw. where
Mhm.
he choreographed his own numbers in Seesaw, but there was an unforgettable showstopper in a show that was kind of mediocre and everything. But after seeing that, you realize that he was a talent to be reckoned with. And every show that he's done, each one is completely different in its scope.
Yes, absolutely. And he really kind of he really emerged with a choreographic statement with that show. That number you're referring to was "It's Not Where You Start" from Seesaw. That's also available on YouTube. You can find that very easily. But it spoke to all the things that the kind of theatrical delight that he brings to virtually every show and every number he does.
Yeah, and one of the things that we've got to go here, we're almost out of time, but if people can find on YouTube, there is the Will Rogers Follies in its complete form. I think it was produced for Japanese television, where
Right.
Tommy Tune actually introduces the show. But the opening number, Willamania, is just such an incredible tour de force of dance and costuming and sets. And then there's a ballet sequence right before Will Rogers and his wife get married, and they call it the Powder Puff Ballet. That is so cleverly done. That's genius. He is a genius.
Yes. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned those two shows. The company that filmed Will Rogers Follies for Japanese TV was one of the backers for the show, and that was one of their requirements for backing the show was that they would do a first class filming of the show for Japanese TV, sort of like for Japanese HBO.
Yeah,
Really,
it's fabulous. Even with the Japanese crawl of translation underneath it, it's worth it.
it's a beautiful capture of that show. Yeah.
Kevin,
Yeah.
where is the book available?
It's available at your favorite local bookstore, if you can find a local bookstore, a brick and mortar store. It's also available in all the major online vendors: Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Abe Books. Anywhere that you shop for books online, you'll be able to find it.
Kevin Winkler, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Read Kevin's new book, all about Tommy Tune. And if you haven't, read his other book, Big Deal, which is his book about Bob Fosse. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Mark. It's been a pleasure.
It
Happy New
has.
Year.
Happy New Year to you. We're going to take a quick break to acknowledge the underwriters that make Artsbeat possible here on Westfield Community Programming, Channel 15 and 89.5 FM WSKB. If you've missed a part of today's program or you want to play it for friends, it's stored on YouTube at WSKB Community Radio, and we'll be right back.
Support for the community programming of WSKB is provided by the Dunkin' Donut Shops of Westfield and the Sardinia family. It's nice to know that even as the world changes, Dunkin' Coffee remains the same at 7 convenient locations throughout Westfield. Underwriting for Community Radio on WSKB is brought to you in part by Rockies. Over 30 convenient locations throughout Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Florida. One of the nation's largest ACE dealers. Expertise and great product selection in paint, hardware, lawn and garden. That's Rockies. Rock solid service since 1926. On the web at rockies.com.
Join me, Tina Gorman, each week from 6 to 8 a.m. for Wake Up Wednesday, when my guests and I discuss health, wellness, and lifestyle reimagined.
Community Radio.
89.5 WSKB.
Live from Studio 120 at Westfield Technical Academy, this is WCPC Channel 15 at 89.5 FM, WSKB Westfield.
Welcome back to Artsbeat, everyone. I'm your host, Mark Auerbach. Peter Goltz is our chief engineer today. And our next segment, we're going to talk with somebody who is working on a phenomenally interesting project. You know, the whole world of COVID has impacted the arts on so many levels. And people are saying, well, when will the COVID experience make its way to music, to dance, and to theater? And if we look back at some of the other trials and tribulations our country has had, for example, the AIDS epidemic in the early 1980s, when AIDS was discovered, it took about 5 to 10 years before plays about people living with HIV, people who had survived it, their caregivers, their family, and their friends were starting to show up on Broadway and on television and in film. And with COVID making our news headlines all the time, it's not going to be too long before the COVID experience on a variety of levels is going to make its way to stage and screen. Vana Nespor, who's our next guest, is working with a small theater company in West Virginia in a small performing arts center where this group of theater people is trying to tell the story of how COVID impacted a small rural town and get this show on the stage. That is best known, for those of you in the greater Springfield area, for doing some rather innovative programming at Bay Path University. And first of all, welcome. And second of all, how did you get from Long Meadow to West Virginia? Or were you in West Virginia and came to Long Meadow and went back to West Virginia?
Hi, Mark, and I'm so glad to be here. In 1982, my husband and I moved to West Virginia. He had a job there, and there was a college that needed an administrator, and I was very young and all excited. But I loved theater. My undergraduate degree was in theater, and so I started directing musicals, about 6 plays and musicals a year for this community, this valley of about 5 counties. It's very sparsely populated. And they loved it. You know, a town of 2,500, and we'd have 500 people in the seats every night in a gymnasium watching The Miracle Worker or My Fair Lady. So we moved away in 1997, and I kept in touch all that time. Eventually, we lived overseas and we came back, came to Bay Path here for the job at Bay Path, working with adult women. And I got a call in February last year. And you remember what February in 2021 was. There was not much we could do. We hadn't had our shots yet. I'm in one of those categories. You're not supposed to go anywhere. And I felt absolutely useless. So my friend calls from this little town, 2,500 people, that built a theater from that group that started so long ago of 300 seats. And they wanted to do a show that really could move the town and help it come back together after a very divisive year and the horror of this virus. So I said, let's write it based on their stories. So in May, I flew down and they commissioned a musical, and I flew down and worked with 4 outstanding local musicians, composers, and I interviewed 30 people who were at EMTs and hospital administrators and funeral parlor owners and children, 9-year-olds and college students. And I audio taped all of those, and I pulled their stories into this musical that is now written and ready to be performed. We were going to perform it in October, and lo and behold, COVID reared its ugly head again, and we had to put it off. And I thought how lucky we were, because now we have a slightly different story to tell. And the heartbreak and the fun. I mean, it is a funny musical as well. Like all musicals based on tragedies, they are mostly based on tragedies. It delves into these lives, and everybody has a humorous tale to tell about Zoom or about getting packages on Prime, and also the tragedy of losing a loved one. So it is powerful. I think, extraordinarily powerful. What these stories, all I did was knit them together, work with the musicians to capture my lyrics and make them come alive. But this is their story.
So you actually knew the people before you went down to interview them, or were a lot of them new faces to you?
The interviewees were all new. I knew the president of the Landis Arts Center. Well, that's Phyllis Cole, was Phyllis Cole then, and now is Melissa Mallow. And I knew them. I knew a few people in town who were as old as I am. But the people that I interviewed, almost all of them were younger. They were working in the middle of this. They were giving the shots. They were calling and doing follow-ups. They were teachers, lawyers, business people, lost their businesses, restaurateurs that were giving food out the windows. So it was, I'll tell you, there wasn't a time, Phyllis went with me to all those to introduce me because they didn't know me. And wasn't a time when we left that there weren't tears in our eyes, because these stories were powerful.
I mean, the people in this town in West Virginia, were their experiences with COVID different because they were in a rural, isolated area than maybe the people that lived in Longmeadow or Springfield that dealt with COVID? Or are there universal themes that we're dealing with that transcend geography?
I think it really does transcend geography. Everybody dealt with this. I think in a smaller community, the problem was that everybody knew everybody who died. Everybody knew everybody who was sick. Small communities, small organizations, you just know everybody. So that meant that in ways that maybe we didn't feel it immediately, it was personal, very personal from the very first day. And it was very, very, as I said, just like here, it was very divisive. Some of the town thought everyone was going to die. Some of the town thought it was a big hoax. Just like here, there were arguments about everything, and that's in the play. And the fact that there were so many people ill. If you're sick during COVID, where do you go? How do you get your cancer treatment? Right?
Yeah.
So what we did was we took 3 families, quintessential families, if you want to call it, very much like families you would see here, father, mother, or single parent. One's a single parent, one's an older couple retired, and how it hit them as well as the town. So there were, I would say, it's the same story. Almost the same story. There are a couple of things different. I bet you haven't heard of the West Virginia Mask Army, have you?
No.
They literally organized, all the women volunteered that could sew and made masks in February, March, and April. And they gave them out free everywhere. And they made them based on a template by a university professor who said you could use furnace filters.
Okay.
So a little different there, but otherwise, this disease has isolated us and divided us, and it has taken people from us. It's made us sick. So I think it very much is our story too. And in fact, they want the play to go out. They want it to be adapted to the areas, that those local stories be added to this play and continue. The belief is that people need to heal. And what people often do, this little community went through a terrible tragedy in 1984 when half of this town, half of it was washed away in a flood. And they just dug out and they went straight ahead. And those scars are still there. It's still hard for them to talk about that, what they lost.
Yeah. Do you know what percentage of the town either had COVID or was impacted by COVID indirectly?
The county has about 10,000 people, and there were about reported over 2,000 cases. So that's 20% of the people already that have had it. I looked at the percentages and looked at Springfield, and per capita, it was very similar, which I didn't expect. I guess, I thought we'd be better,
Yeah.
maybe than a rural community where everybody was so close, but no, we're very similar in the percentage of infection rates. And, West Virginia got the vaccine out in January. Took us a lot longer.
Yeah, I was going to ask also, were people in this community more resistant to wearing masks and social mandating and politicizing the whole thing the way it happens here, or were they more compliant in terms of, as a community, trying to keep everybody safe?
I wish I could say that they all just, jumped on the bandwagon, and no, they were just exactly like us. There were groups that begging them to wear a mask and begging them to take the vaccine. People, the doctors, the nurses, just are still out there begging because, as you know, this latest variant Omicron is coming through, and it's really, the numbers are going up and up here and there. So no, that's why I think it's a universal story. It's very much about how we resist being told what to do.
Right.
And it's just basic human nature to question, right?
Yeah, it is. So you went down and you did this interviews with these people. How long did it take you to take the interviews and turn it into a script? And that's my first question. My second question is, how did the people who were interviewed respond to seeing their stories in the script, or have they not yet seen it as a play?
They have not seen it as a play. And your first question was?
How long did it take you to turn their stories into a script?
It was the community, the cast. There are about 25 members in the cast, and we cast it from local people. I think I needed to tell that story so badly. I finished the first draft by the end of August, and we had all the music by the end of September, every piece of it. But then, of course, the end of August isn't the whole story. And I realized because the actors read it, we did it via Zoom once, and I went down there once. And it was every time they read it, they would give me feedback on what was missing, what I needed to do. Originally, I thought I'd just take the stories and have them read, right?
Yeah.
Just pieces of them would be the easy thing. No, they said, no. We want to know that these are real people. So we have to have a family. So we put in 3 families that represented all the different viewpoints and feelings and tragedies that had happened in that community. And I think what surprised me so much is the West Virginia Arts Council gave them money, the local citizenry. I mean, nobody wants to deal with COVID, but when people said, we're going to hear your stories and your stories are going to get told. Now, the cast who did hear the whole show, I asked them whether this sounded like it was their story. Did I do the job that they'd asked me to do? And this one young man who plays a boy in the show said, you hit it on that nail on the head right through the floor. So this is their story. Okay.
Yeah.
And so I've been tweaking it ever since, adding as COVID has continued to abuse us, because we have to deal with the anger we're all feeling. I mean, we're all angry, right? that this is continuing, that it has come back, that we did everything right, and it came back, and it's still hurting people. So how do you deal with that? The theme song, if you want to call it, of the show is An Ordinary Town, right? So this happens to an ordinary town. This COVID comes and splits everybody up and hurts people and kills them, and people try to still have normal lives. They still try to celebrate birthdays, and they Zoom, and they leave food for each other, just like we do, right?
Yeah.
And then they think it's going away. The spring comes, and even in May, and when I was down there, people were still really raw. They were feeling these stories, and that they were more candid than I would ever have been. Floored me. I promised them that the specific words would never come back at them, because they told me what it was like for them personally, how it doctors weren't taking care of themselves to the point that they were nearly falling apart. Does that sound familiar?
It does. And oddly enough, I covered many years ago the film Schindler's List when it first came out, which there was a lot of renewed interest in the Holocaust at that point. And there were several Holocaust survivors in Greater Springfield that I was able to have the opportunity to interview as I was working on this radio and print series that I did. And some of them, a couple of them had survived, and they were seeing their story. They were part of the people that Schindler had saved. And this was like 50 years later. They were children at the time, and now they were seniors looking back at this, and they realized that if their story wasn't told, it would be forgotten. But they had a half a century to process it and move forward or whatever with their lives. The people that you're writing about are still evolving in this crisis. And I would assume that for some of them, particularly if they're playing the role as actors, playing the role of real people in the town that they interact with day by day, who may have gotten sick since the play was written, or lost a relative, or lost a job, or been impacted in some way, that it's very raw and personal and difficult to distance so that you can be objective about what you're trying to say.
I think you're right, but they want to say it. It's what I'm seeing as I'm directing the play, which now comes off April 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, the first 2 weekends in April. And I'm looking for a place here in the Valley to put on the play here, adapted to the Valley. So if you know of any good community theaters that would like to host this play. But I think that what I saw was healing. So one of the members who's helping produce this lost her husband to COVID. They had been married for 35, 40 years. And at first she was helping me, but she was really pushing back. And now I see her more and more wanting this told. Because you're right. What happens is we forget. And we rewrite. We forget that people were spraying things with Lysol, remember?
Yeah.
Bug killer. We were afraid to touch boxes. Those things we can laugh at now. Those are the little things that we can remember and say, yeah, we know better now, right? But not then. And if we can capture those, we honor all of the people who went through that. I think that's what's really important. I don't think people stop enough after a tragedy to really think about that process, and that keeps them from healing. I'm really interested also in in your book and what you wrote there, because I think that the great tragedy of the 20th century, the Holocaust, to be able to capture that from people who were there, I wonder how this will be seen in 50 years.
It will be interesting because, you look at other tragedies and crises that we as a civilization have gone through. For example, 9/11. Most of us, we have this vision of those Twin Towers imploding in our mind. We have the visions of the planes flying into the Pentagon. And the biggest hit musical on Broadway right now is a musical called Come From Away, which tells the story of a small town in Newfoundland near the Gander Airport where hundreds of flights were diverted. And the people aboard these planes were forced to live at the mercy, I guess, of the townspeople who took them in and fed them and clothed them and kept them warm. It's 20 years after 9/11. And it's these human stories and the people, the stories of the people who died and the people who survived and the changes in their life that are the stories that we want to hear now. And with COVID, we've seen on the media focusing on the first responders. I mean, almost every newscast has got something about the numbers of those people that are infected and people that are dying and families being torn apart and all of that. But the human element of it is something that we're going to want to hear, and even after COVID is in the past, if it ever is. I mean, we may be living in a new normal, but I think people are going to want to know about how that first responder responded or what that doctor felt like. And I've seen through one of my clients that does videos, healthcare videos, and has done a lot of filmmaking of first responders. And when they talk about the stories of a dying person with a nurse holding a laptop so they can FaceTime with their family because the families can't come to the hospital. These human stories are the ones that really are going to impact us more, I think, than the statistics and the numbers and who did what and who provided that vaccine and who pushed out this healthcare proxy and this and that. So my hope is that the play that you're writing, which is first-person stories of these people, if it's not appreciated now and understood now because it's all too raw, that 10 years from now or 15 years from now can really tell a chapter in our collective lives, whether it's a good chapter or a bad chapter.
Well, I think also a musical is a different animal. The Library of Congress says that along with jazz, the American musical is quintessentially American. It's this magical place where tragedy, horror can be in front of us, and we sing and dance. We accept that people break out in song, and it somehow makes it easier to process that tragedy. I mean, the Annie is about the Great Depression and orphans, and Cabaret is about the Nazis taking over Germany. These are not things you normally think singing and dancing would be part of. I think that musicals allow us as Americans, this is just my theory, to process things we would not stand to watch otherwise. So I'm hoping that the music, which I think the composers have done an extraordinary job. It's got Western kind of feel to it, country feel, and all the way to big show tunes. That it helps people think about those losses in a way that they can find some distance now. And you're right. It'll be interesting how it's perceived and how these intimate stories are perceived in 5, 10, 20 years.
Yeah. One last question, because we're just about out of time. Where did the composers come from? Are they from the town?
There are two towns very close to each other called Moorfield and Petersburg. Petersburg is where the Landis Art Center is. And two of them, Jim Townsend and Jeremiah Hines, comes from Moorfield, and Tammy Western and Joe Kreitz are from Petersburg. And these are performers. One of them's two of them are classically trained composers of very contemporary classical music. And two of them are country, Western, or gospel people. But they adapted to this very different genre extraordinarily well and with so much fun.
So they too know the people that are
They
involved.
know.
Exactly.
They know all the people.
Yeah.
They know all the people who would have told us those stories. They know all the people who are in the show. So yeah, and it's and the point of the show isn't about COVID. It's about how a community survives it by coming back together. And that's what we hope the show helps people do, by forgiving people who offended us and reaching out and embracing those who we may not agree with, but they're our neighbors, they're our family. And so the point of the show is to help that little community come together again. I think that's what everybody who's a part of this believes it will do.
Well, I hope after the performances take place in April, maybe you can come back and tell us how it went, because I'm fascinated by this. And I hope that they record some of it so that you'll be able to share it with people here in Western Massachusetts.
I'd love to. Thank you so much.
We've been chatting with Vana Nespor, who's been working with a group of people in West Virginia to produce a musical that tells the stories of a small town in West Virginia, the people whose lives have been impacted by COVID, and how they're moving forward in their role and world during the pandemic. And that wraps up another edition of Artsbeat. If you missed a part of today's program and you want to catch it again, you can find it on YouTube under WSKB Community Radio's YouTube page. Peter Coles has been our chief engineer. We'll be back next week with another edition of Artsbeat. Thanks for joining us.
Into a cabaret one fatal day, a little songbird flew.
Found it so very gay, he thought he'd stay just to get a bird's eye view.
When he heard the jazz band playing,
He was happy as a lark,
to each measure he kept swaying.
and he stayed till after dark.
Then back to the land he knew, thrilled through and through, he sailed on in the air.
Called all the other birds, and in these words started gurgling then and there. I'm a little jazz bird, and I'm telling you to be one too. For a little jazz bird is in heaven when he's singing blue. I say it with regret, but you're out of date. You ain't heard nothing yet till you syncopate. When the going is rough, you will find your troubles all have flown. If you wobble, you wobble like the moaning of a saxophone. Just try my recipe, and I'm sure you'll agree that a little jazz bird is the only kind of bird to be. bird is the only kind of bird.
A little jazzbird is the only kind of bird.